In the mists of time, before the Romans ever set foot on distant shores, before Christianity spread its gentle light across Europe, there existed a world where magic pulsed through every stone, every stream, every whispered word on the wind. This was the realm of the Celts, a people whose stories have echoed through millennia, whose gods and heroes still stir something primal within us, whose mythology contains secrets that modern minds can barely grasp. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of sleep, let me take you on a journey through the most enchanting, the most mysterious, the most captivating collection of myths and legends the world has ever known. This isn't just another bedtime story. This is the complete tapestry of Celtic mythology, woven together in all its beautiful, terrifying, magical complexity. Picture this: warriors who could split mountains with their bare hands, goddesses who commanded the very forces of nature, druids who held the secrets of life and death in their ancient wisdom. Imagine shape-shifting creatures that could become anything from ravens to wolves to beautiful maidens, otherworldly realms where time flows differently, and a single day might last 1,000 years, and heroes whose deeds were so magnificent that bards would sing of them for generations. But here's what makes Celtic mythology truly extraordinary. Unlike the neat, organized pantheons of Greek or Roman gods, Celtic mythology is wild, untamed, contradictory. It's a living, breathing collection of stories that changed with each telling, evolved with each tribe, grew richer with each generation. These weren't just entertainment around the fire. These were the fundamental truths that shaped how an entire civilization understood life, death, honor, love, war, and the mysterious forces that govern our world. What you're about to experience is something remarkable. We're going to journey through every major cycle of Celtic myth, from the primordial mythological cycle that tells of the very first inhabitants of Ireland, through the Ulster cycle with its legendary hero Cú Chulainn, into the Fenian cycle with the mighty Finn MacCool, and beyond into the rich Welsh traditions of the Mabinogion. We'll meet the Tuatha Dé Danann, the godlike people who brought magic to Ireland. We'll witness the great cattle raid of Cooley that sparked the most famous war in Celtic literature. We'll explore the otherworld, that mystical realm that exists parallel to our own. And here's the beautiful part. As your mind relaxes and your body prepares for sleep, these ancient stories will wash over you like a gentle tide, carrying you into dreams filled with magic and wonder. The rhythmic cadence of these tales, told in the same way they've been shared for thousands of years, will guide you into the most peaceful, restorative sleep you've ever experienced. So close your eyes, settle deeper into your pillow, and let the ancient voices of the Celtic storytellers carry you away. Our journey begins in the very mists of creation itself, in a time before time, when the world was young and magic was as common as breathing. Long before the green hills of Ireland knew the footsteps of mortal men, before the valleys of Wales echoed with human voices, before the highlands of Scotland felt the warmth of human hearths, there existed beings of such power and beauty that they seemed like living dreams. These were the first inhabitants of the Celtic world, creatures of myth and magic whose stories form the foundation of everything that would follow. In the beginning, according to the ancient Irish tradition, there was only the endless sea and the mists that danced above it. From these primordial waters emerged the first race to claim the Emerald Isle. They were called the Partholonians, led by a man named Partholon, who had fled his homeland after committing a terrible crime. These were not gods, not quite, but beings touched by otherworldly power, refugees from a distant realm who sought to make Ireland their new home. For 300 years, the Partholonians dwelt in Ireland, and during their time, they performed the first great works of civilization. They cleared 4 great plains, carved out 7 lakes, and kindled the first fires that would burn continuously for generations. They brought with them the arts of brewing, metalworking, and agriculture. But their time was not destined to last. A great plague swept through their people, and in the span of a single week, every Partholonian died, leaving Ireland empty once more, waiting for the next wave of settlers to claim its shores. The emptiness did not last long. From the northern seas came the Nemedians, descendants of a great leader named Nemed, whose name meant sacred or privileged. These people were mighty workers, and under their hands, Ireland bloomed like never before. They cleared 12 more plains and dug 16 lakes, their efforts reshaping the very landscape of the island. The Nemedians built great fortresses and established laws, creating the first true civilization that Ireland had known. But the Nemedians faced a challenge that would test their courage and their magic. From across the Western Sea came a race of beings so terrible that their very name struck fear into the hearts of all who heard it. These were the Fomorians, ancient sea gods and demons of chaos, beings of such primal power that they seemed to embody the destructive forces of nature itself, led by their king Balor of the Evil Eye, whose single glance could kill any living thing. The Fomorians demanded tribute from the Nemedians. For generations, the Nemedians labored under this terrible burden. Every year on the feast of Samhain, when the veil between worlds grew thin, they were forced to deliver 2/3 of their children, their grain, and their cattle to the Fomorians. The tribute was collected at the Tower of Conand, a massive fortress the Fomorians had built on Tory Island, off the northwest coast of Ireland. The oppression grew unbearable. Finally, the Nemedians could endure no more. They rose in desperate rebellion against their Fomorian overlords, gathering every warrior they could muster for a final, climactic battle. The war that followed was catastrophic. Though the Nemedians managed to destroy the Tower of Conand and slay many Fomorians, the cost was terrible. So many died in the fighting that only 30 Nemedians survived, and these few scattered to the winds, fleeing Ireland to seek new homes in distant lands. Once again, Ireland lay empty, its green hills and crystal streams knowing only the songs of birds and the whisper of wind through ancient trees. But the scattered children of Nemed had not forgotten their homeland. In the distant corners of the world, they grew and multiplied, learning new arts and gathering new powers. Some went to the northern islands of the world, where they studied magic and druidcraft. Others traveled to Greece, where they were enslaved but never broken, their spirits yearning always for the homeland their ancestors had lost. It was from Greece that the next wave of settlers came, though they arrived not as conquerors, but as refugees fleeing bondage. These were the Fir-Bolg, the men of bags, so called, because their Greek masters had forced them to carry soil in leather bags to create fertile ground where none existed. They were a hardy people, strengthened by generations of toil, and when they finally won their freedom, they sailed west across the dark Atlantic, following the ancient songs that told of a green island where their ancestors had once dwelt. The Fir-Bolg found Ireland much as the Nemedians had left it, wild and beautiful but empty of human habitation. They divided the island among their 5 leaders, creating the 5 provinces that would shape Irish geography for all time to come. Under their rule, Ireland knew peace and prosperity. They established the first true kingship, choosing their rulers not by birth alone, but by worth and wisdom. They created laws and customs that would endure for centuries, and they held the first great assembly at Tara, that sacred hill that would become the seat of Irish high kings. But even as the Firbolg built their civilization, forces were stirring in the northern mists that would change Ireland forever. On the mystical islands of the north, the other branch of Nemed's children had not been idle. They had become something more than human, something closer to the gods themselves. They had learned the deepest secrets of magic and druidcraft, mastering arts that could reshape reality itself. They called themselves the Tuatha Dé Danann, the people of the goddess Danu, and they were preparing to reclaim the homeland their ancestors had lost. The Tuatha Dé Danann were unlike any people who had come before them. They possessed 4 great treasures, magical artifacts of such power that each one could change the fate of nations. There was the Stone of Destiny from Falias, which would cry out when touched by the rightful king of Ireland. From Gorias came the invincible Spear of Lugh, which never missed its target and always brought victory to whoever wielded it. From Findias came the Sword of Nuada, from which no enemy could escape once it was drawn. And from Murias came the Cauldron of the Dagda, which could feed any number of people and never be emptied. When the Tuatha Dé Danann arrived in Ireland, they came not in ships, but in a great cloud that darkened the sky for 3 days and 3 nights. Some say they burned their vessels upon landing, making the smoke that heralded their arrival. Others claim they came through the air itself, masters of powers that defied the natural order. However they arrived, their coming marked the beginning of the age of magic in Ireland. The Firbolg, seeing this supernatural arrival, knew that their time of peaceful rule was ending. They sent messengers to the strange newcomers, hoping to avoid conflict through negotiation. The 2 peoples met on a plain in Connaught, and there they exchanged weapons and gifts, each trying to understand the other. The Firbolg were impressed by the fine craftsmanship of the Tuatha Dé Danann's weapons, while the magical people admired the sturdy, practical tools of the Firbolg. But despite these courteous exchanges, both sides knew that Ireland was not large enough for 2 peoples to rule. The Tuatha Dé Danann offered to divide the island equally, but the Firbolg, who had worked so hard to build their kingdom, refused to give up any of their territory. War became inevitable. The great battle was fought at Mag Tuired, the Plain of Towers, and it was a conflict unlike any the world had seen before. On one side stood the Firbolg, brave and determined, fighting with bronze weapons and iron courage. On the other side marched the Tuatha Dé Danann, wielding magic along with their weapons, their very presence seeming to make the earth itself come alive. The battle raged for 4 days, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Firbolg fought with the desperation of men defending their homes, while the Tuatha Dé Danann wielded powers that seemed to bend the very laws of nature. On the 4th day, the tide of battle finally turned. Nuada, the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, faced Shreng, the champion of the Firbolg, in single combat. Their duel was so fierce that it shook the ground beneath their feet, but in the end, Shreng's sword struck Nuada's arm, severing the hand and ending the single combat. Though Nuada was wounded, his people pressed their advantage. The magical weapons and otherworldly powers of the Tuatha Dé Danann proved too much for the Firbolg to withstand. Their king, Eochaid mac Éirc, fell in the fighting, and with his death, the resistance of the Firbolg crumbled. But the Tuatha Dé Danann were not cruel conquerors. They allowed the surviving Firbolg to choose their fate. Some departed Ireland entirely, seeking new homes beyond the sea. Others remained, accepting the rule of the Tuatha Dé Danann and becoming part of their new kingdom. The province of Connaught was given to the Firbolg as their own, where they could live according to their ancient customs while acknowledging the sovereignty of their conquerors. Thus began the golden age of the Tuatha Dé Danann, when magic flowed through Ireland like water through a riverbed, when the gods walked openly among mortals, when the very landscape itself seemed alive with supernatural power. This was the time when the great heroes of Irish mythology performed their legendary deeds, when love and war and magic intertwined to create stories that would echo through the ages. But even in this golden age, challenges remained. The ancient Fomorians still lurked in their underwater realms and distant islands, nursing their hatred for those who dwelt on the land. And Nuada, the king of the Tuatha Dé Danann, faced a crisis that threatened to tear his people apart. For in losing his hand at the Battle of Mag Tuired, he had lost more than flesh and bone. He had lost his right to rule. Among the Tuatha Dé Danann, there existed an ancient law as immutable as the turning of the seasons. No king could rule who bore a physical blemish, for the ruler must be perfect in body as well as in spirit to maintain the harmony between the earthly realm and the other world. Nuada's severed hand, though lost in honorable combat, marked him as unfit to wear the crown. The very magic that flowed through the land seemed to diminish with each passing day, that an imperfect king sat upon the throne. The nobles of the Tuatha Dé Danann gathered in council, their voices heavy with sorrow as they spoke of the need for a new ruler. Among them stood Brigid, son of a Fomorian father and a woman of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He was beautiful beyond description, his features so perfect that poets would struggle to find words adequate to capture his radiance. His hair gleamed like spun gold in sunlight. His eyes held the depth of summer skies, and his voice carried the music of harps and silver bells. The council, swayed by his beauty and his mixed heritage that might bring peace between their people and the Fomorians, chose Brigid as their new king. Nuada, though his heart ached to surrender the crown he had worn with such honor, accepted their decision with the dignity befitting a true leader. He stepped down from the throne, and Brigid was crowned with great ceremony, the sacred regalia passing to hands that had never known the weight of battle or the burden of true leadership. At first, the reign of Brigid seemed blessed by fortune itself. His beauty drew admiration from all who beheld him, and his Fomorian blood opened channels of communication with those ancient enemies who had long threatened the peace of Ireland. Treaties were signed, tributes negotiated, and for a time it seemed that the golden age would continue under this new, radiant king. But beauty, as the wise druids knew, is not the same as wisdom, and perfection of form does not guarantee nobility of spirit. As the seasons turned and Brigid settled into his role as ruler, his true nature began to reveal itself like shadows emerging at twilight. The man who had seemed so perfect proved to be perhaps the most imperfect king who ever sat upon a throne. Brigid ruled not with the generous heart of a true Irish king, but with the calculating coldness of his Fomorian heritage. Where Irish custom demanded that a king be hospitable, entertaining all visitors with lavish feasts and rich gifts, Brigid grew increasingly stingy and mean-spirited. The great hall of Tara, which should have echoed with laughter and the songs of bards, fell silent as Brigid turned away visitors and offered neither food nor drink to those who sought his hospitality. The warriors of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who had expected honor and reward for their service, found themselves given the most menial tasks. Brigid commanded the mighty Dagda, their chief druid and god of abundance, to dig ditches and build fortifications like a common laborer. Ogma, their champion and god of eloquence, was forced to gather firewood, his powerful hands that had once wielded legendary weapons, now reduced to carrying bundles of sticks. Even worse was the fate of the artists and craftsmen who had made the Tuatha Dé Danann famous throughout the known world. Bress showed no appreciation for poetry, music, or the fine arts that enriched the spirit and elevated the soul. The bards found their voices unwelcome in his halls. The musicians discovered their melodies fell on deaf ears, and the craftsmen saw their exquisite work dismissed as frivolous luxury. The breaking point came when Cairpre, the chief poet of the Tuatha Dé Danann, arrived at Bress's court seeking the hospitality that was the right of every bard. Instead of being welcomed with honor and treated to the finest food and drink, Cairpre was housed in a cold, dark chamber and given only 3 dry cakes and a cup of water for his sustenance. The insult to the office of chief poet was an insult to all the Tuatha Dé Danann, and Cairpre's response would echo through the ages. Standing before the miserly king, Cairpre composed the first satirical poem ever spoken in Ireland. His words carried a power beyond mere verse, for the speech of a poet could wound deeper than any sword and bring shame that would last longer than any physical scar. The satire he laid upon Bress was like a curse, prophesying that the king's reign would bring nothing but barrenness and sorrow to the land. As Cairpre's words rang through the hall, something extraordinary happened. Bress's perfect face, which had never known blemish or flaw, erupted in angry red blotches. The satirical verse had marked him as surely as any sword stroke, and by the ancient law of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a blemished king could not rule. The nobles who had once admired Bress's beauty now saw him clearly for what he truly was. They demanded his abdication, and Bress, faced with universal condemnation, had no choice but to surrender the crown. But his humiliation drove him to a desperate course of action that would plunge Ireland into its greatest crisis yet. Fleeing to his Fomorian kinfolk across the sea, Bress painted a picture of persecution and injustice, claiming that the Tuatha Dé Danann had wronged him purely out of prejudice against his mixed heritage. The Fomorians, always eager for an excuse to wage war against the people of the land, rallied to Bress's cause. Their king, the terrible Baler of the Evil Eye, gathered the greatest army that had ever been assembled, drawing warriors not only from the sea kingdoms of the Fomorians, but from every dark corner of the otherworld. Giants and demons, sea monsters and shapeshifters, beings of such malevolent power that their very presence poisoned the air around them, all marched under Baler's banner. Meanwhile, in Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann faced their own crisis of leadership. With Bress gone and Nuada still bearing the wound that barred him from kingship, they needed a ruler who could unite them against the coming storm. It was then that Dian Cecht, the greatest physician among the Tuatha Dé Danann, performed a miracle that would change the course of history. Working with all the skill of his divine healing arts, and aided by the magical craftsmanship of Credne the Right, Dian Cecht created for Nuada a hand of pure silver, so perfectly formed and so skillfully attached that it moved and functioned like living flesh. The silver hand, as it came to be known, was a marvel of both medical science and magical artistry, restoring Nuada's physical perfection and with it his right to rule. But even as Nuada reclaimed his throne, the Tuatha Dé Danann knew that they would need more than a restored king to face the approaching Fomorian host. They needed a champion whose power could match that of Baler himself, a hero whose very presence could turn the tide of the greatest battle ever fought on Irish soil. It was at this darkest hour that a young man appeared at the gates of Tara, seeking admission to the court of the Tuatha Dé Danann. He was tall and handsome, with hair that caught the light like burnished copper, and eyes that held the fierce brightness of the sun itself. When the gatekeeper challenged him, asking what skills he possessed that might earn him a place among the divine people, the young man's answer would echo through legend. "I am skilled in all the arts," he declared with quiet confidence. I am a carpenter. The gatekeeper replied that they already had Luchtain the right, the finest carpenter in all the world. I am a smith, the young man continued. But they had Colum Qualinesh, whose metalwork was beyond compare. I am a warrior, he said next, but they had Ogma the champion. I am a poet, he declared, but they had Cairpré of the melodious voice. One by one, the young man listed his skills. Harper, historian, sorcerer, physician, cupbearer, brazier worker. To each claim, the gatekeeper responded that they already had the greatest master of that art among their people. Finally, the young man smiled, and his smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. Go to your king, he said, and ask him this. Does he have among all his people one man who is skilled in every art? For I am master of them all, and I have come to serve the Tuatha Dé Danann in their hour of greatest need. The gatekeeper hurried to Nuada with this message, and the king's eyes widened with understanding. This was no ordinary warrior seeking service. This was Lugh of the Long Arm, master of all skills, the shining one whose very name meant light. Nuada commanded that the gates be thrown open immediately, for he recognized in this young hero the champion they had prayed for. When Lugh entered the great hall of Tara, his presence seemed to fill the space with golden radiance. He carried with him the invincible spear from Gorias, the weapon that never failed to find its mark. At his side hung a sword that could cut through any armor, and on his arm he bore a shield that no weapon could pierce. But his greatest weapon was his mind. Quick as lightning and brilliant as the sun he was said to embody. Nuada, recognizing divine destiny when he saw it, did something unprecedented. He rose from his throne and offered it to Lugh, declaring that the young hero should lead the Tuatha Dé Danann in the coming war. For 13 days, Lugh held counsel with the greatest warriors and wisest druids among the divine people, planning strategies that would allow them to face the overwhelming might of the Fomorian host. The preparations for war were unlike anything Ireland had ever seen. Every warrior sharpened his weapons and polished his armor. Every druid prepared spells of protection and power. Every craftsman worked day and night to forge new weapons and strengthen old ones. The very earth seemed to thrum with anticipation as two supernatural armies prepared to meet in battle. When the Fomorian fleet finally appeared on the horizon, it stretched from one end of the sky to the other, their black sails blotting out the sun like storm clouds gathering for the end of the world. Balor of the Evil Eye stood at the prow of the flagship, his terrible gaze hidden behind a massive eyelid that required 4 men to lift whenever he wished to use his deadly power. The two armies met at Mag Tuired, but this was not the same plain where the Tuatha Dé Danann had fought the Firbolg. This was the second battle of Mag Tuired, and it would determine not just who ruled Ireland, but whether the forces of light and order could triumph over chaos and darkness. The battle began at dawn, and from the first clash of weapons, it was clear that this would be no ordinary conflict. Magic flew through the air like deadly birds, spells crashed against shields with the force of thunderbolts, and the very ground shook beneath the feet of supernatural warriors locked in mortal combat. The clash of divine armies shook the very foundations of the world. Weapons forged in otherworldly fires met shields blessed by ancient gods, and the sound of their collision rang like thunder across the Irish countryside. Warriors who had never known defeat fell beneath supernatural blades, while heroes whose names would echo through eternity carved their legends in blood and glory upon that fateful field. In the thick of battle, the Dagda wielded his mighty club, a weapon so enormous that it required wheels to move it, yet in his hands it became as swift as lightning. With one end, he could slay 9 men with a single blow, while the other end could restore life to the fallen. His very presence on the battlefield was like a force of nature unleashed, and wherever he strode, the earth itself seemed to aid the cause of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Ogma the champion carved through enemy ranks with his legendary sword, each stroke a masterwork of deadly precision. The god of eloquence proved that his skill with words was matched only by his prowess with blade, and the Fomorian warriors learned to fear the approach of his distinctive war cry echoing across the field of battle. But it was the young god Lu who truly turned the tide of war. Moving through the conflict like a being of pure light, he seemed to be everywhere at once, inspiring his allies while striking terror into the hearts of his enemies. His spear never missed its mark, his sword never failed to find its target, and his very presence seemed to make the sun shine brighter, even through the storm clouds of war. The battle raged for days, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. The Fomorians fought with the fury of ancient chaos, their monstrous forms and terrible weapons dealing devastation among the ranks of the Tuatha Dé Danann. Sea demons rose from the nearby coast to join their land-based kin, and creatures of nightmare stalked the battlefield, their roars drowning out the clash of weapons and the cries of the wounded. Yet for all their supernatural might, the Fomorians could not break the resolve of the Tuatha Dé Danann. These were the people who had mastered the 4 great treasures, who had learned the deepest secrets of magic in the northern islands of the world. They fought not just for victory, but for the very soul of Ireland itself, and that knowledge gave them strength beyond their individual power. As the battle reached its climax, all eyes turned to the confrontation that would determine the fate of both armies. Balor of the Evil Eye, the terrible king of the Fomorians, strode onto the field of battle, his massive form towering above mortal warriors like a mountain above hills. His single eye remained closed, but all who saw him trembled, for they knew that when that eyelid lifted, death would follow as surely as shadow follows light. The warriors of both armies drew back, creating a circle around the Fomorian king, for none dared come within range of his deadly gaze. Even the bravest heroes of the Tuatha Dé Danann hesitated to face an enemy whose very look could end their immortal existence. The silence that fell over the battlefield was more ominous than any war cry, pregnant with the knowledge that the next few moments would decide everything. It was then that Lu stepped forward, his radiant form shining like a star against the darkness that seemed to emanate from Balor's presence. The young god showed no fear as he approached his monstrous opponent, though he knew full well the power that lay hidden behind that massive eyelid. In his hand, he carried a sling, not one of the great magical weapons of his people, but a simple shepherd's tool that he had mastered in his youth. "Open your eye, grandfather," Lu called out, his voice carrying clearly across the silent battlefield. For it was true that Balor was his grandfather, the prophecies having foretold that the Fomorian king would die by the hand of his own grandson, which was why Balor had tried so desperately to prevent any such child from being born. Balor laughed, a sound like boulders crashing down a mountainside. "So the prophecy has brought you to me at last, boy. Very well. Look upon your death, and know that not even destiny can save you from my gaze." 4 mighty Fomorian warriors strained to lift Balor's eyelid, their muscles bulging with the effort required to reveal that terrible eye. As the lid slowly rose, the very air seemed to shimmer with deadly power. Plants withered, birds fell from the sky, and even the stones of the earth cracked under the malevolent force of that gaze. But Lugh was ready. Even as the eye opened, his sling was already in motion, the stone flying true with all the skill and power of the god of light behind it. The projectile struck Balor's eye with such force that it drove the orb clear through the back of his skull, and as it passed through his head, the deadly gaze was turned upon the Fomorian army behind him. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Dozens of Fomorian warriors fell dead in the ranks behind their king, struck down by their own leader's fatal power. Balor himself crashed to the earth like a felled tree, his massive form shaking the ground with its impact. The eye of Balor, which had terrorized the world for generations beyond counting, was closed forever. With their king dead and their ranks devastated by his own power, the Fomorian army broke and fled. Some retreated to their underwater kingdoms beneath the waves, others to distant islands shrouded in perpetual mist. A few submitted to the victorious Tuatha Dé Danann, but most simply vanished into the otherworld, becoming creatures of legend and nightmare that would occasionally trouble the mortal world in ages to come. The victory at the Second Battle of Mag Tuaird established the Tuatha Dé Danann as the undisputed masters of Ireland. No longer would they need to fear invasion from the chaotic forces of the sea. The land was theirs to rule according to their wisdom and their magic, and under their governance, Ireland entered its true golden age. Lugh, the hero of the battle, was hailed as the greatest champion among a people of champions. His victory over Balor became the stuff of legend, sung by bards around fires for countless generations. But the young god knew that with great power came great responsibility, and he set about using his skills not just for war, but for the betterment of all who dwelt in Ireland. Under Lugh's guidance, the arts and crafts of civilization flourished as never before. He established great festivals where the finest artisans could display their work, where poets could share their verses, where musicians could weave melodies that captured the very essence of the Irish spirit. The festival of Lughnasadh, marking the beginning of the harvest season, became one of the most important celebrations in the Celtic calendar, a time when all the tribes would gather to honor both the god and the abundance of the land. Nuada, restored to his rightful place as king, ruled with wisdom and justice, his silver hand becoming a symbol of how even the greatest wounds could be healed through skill and determination. The Dagda ensured that the land remained fertile and the people well-fed, his great cauldron providing sustenance for all who needed it. Brigid, the goddess of smithcraft, poetry, and healing, taught mortals the secrets of working metal and weaving words into powerful verses. But perhaps the greatest gift the Tuatha Dé Danann gave to Ireland was the establishment of the sacred sites that would become the spiritual heart of the island. They raised great stone circles that aligned with the movements of sun and stars, allowing mortals to track the passage of time and understand their place in the cosmic order. They carved spirals and symbols into standing stones, creating a written language of spiritual power that would endure long after their own reign had ended. The Hill of Tara became their greatest achievement, a complex of earthworks and stone monuments that served as both royal residence and sacred temple. From this elevated seat, the High Kings of Ireland would rule for millennia to come, each one drawing legitimacy from the connection to the divine people who had first established the throne. The Stone of Destiny, one of the 4 great treasures of the Tuatha Dé Danann, was placed at Tara, where it would cry out in recognition whenever the rightful king touched it. Throughout Ireland, the Tuatha Dé Danann established other sacred centers, each one carefully positioned to take advantage of the natural flow of magical energy through the landscape. Newgrange, with its magnificent passage tomb aligned to capture the light of the winter solstice, became a gateway between the world of mortals and the realm of the gods. The ancient trees of the sacred groves were marked as places where humans could commune with the divine, and wells and springs were blessed as sources of healing and wisdom. Yet even in this golden age, the wise among the Tuatha Dé Danann understood that their time of open rule over Ireland would not last forever. The world was changing, and new peoples were stirring beyond the horizons, peoples who would bring different ways and different beliefs to the Emerald Isle. The druids, those keepers of ancient wisdom who served as advisors to the divine kings, spoke in whispers of visions they had seen in the smoke of sacred fires and the flight of birds across the sky. These prophecies told of the coming of the Milesians, the sons of Mil, who would arrive from distant Iberia to claim Ireland as their own. Unlike the previous waves of settlers, these would be fully mortal humans, possessed of iron weapons and a determination that would prove impossible to turn aside. The age of the gods walking openly among mortals was drawing to a close, though their influence would never truly fade from the land they had shaped with their magic. Some among the Tuatha Dé Danann raged against this fate, arguing that they should use their divine power to prevent the arrival of these mortals or destroy them if they dared to set foot on Irish soil. But the wisest of their number, including Lugh himself, understood that opposing destiny was futile. The wheel of time turned for gods as well as mortals, and each age must give way to the next in the eternal cycle of creation and change. Instead of fighting the inevitable, the Tuatha Dé Danann began to prepare for their withdrawal from the visible world. They would not disappear entirely, for gods cannot truly die, but they would step back into the other world, becoming the hidden powers that would guide and influence Ireland from behind the veil of mortal perception. This transition would not be a defeat, but a transformation, allowing them to become something even more powerful than they had been as visible rulers. The great halls of Tara began to echo with a different kind of music, as the divine people prepared for their departure. No longer were these the war songs celebrating victory over enemies, but rather the haunting melodies that spoke of endings and new beginnings, of love that transcends death and power, that endures beyond the visible world. The bards among the Tuatha Dé Danann composed the first great cycles of Irish literature, weaving their own history into verses that would preserve their memory long after their physical forms had faded from mortal sight. As the seasons turned and the years passed, strange ships began to appear on the southern horizon, their sails filled with winds that carried the scent of distant lands. The time of prophecy was at hand, and the sons of Mil were approaching Ireland with the inevitability of fate itself. The golden age of the Tuatha Dé Danann was drawing to its close, but their legacy would endure in the very stones of Ireland, in the flow of her rivers, in the whisper of wind through her ancient forests. The final chapter of their visible reign was about to begin, and with it would come the establishment of the world that mortals would inherit. A world where magic still flowed, but was hidden from ordinary sight, where the gods still watched and guided, but from realms beyond normal perception. The stage was being set for the great drama that would unfold when divine beings and mortal heroes would meet in contests that would determine not just who ruled Ireland, but how the relationship between the seen and unseen worlds would be established for all time to come. In the gathering twilight of their age, the Tuatha Dé Danann stood ready to face their greatest challenge yet, knowing that their sacrifice would purchase something far more valuable than continued dominion over a single island. They were about to ensure that the magic they had brought to Ireland would never truly die, but would instead flow like an underground river through all the generations of mortals yet to come, surfacing whenever the need was greatest and heroes arose to channel its power. The ships that appeared on the southern horizon carried more than mortal warriors and their weapons. They bore the hopes and dreams of a people who had wandered for generations, following prophecies and ancient promises through lands both fair and hostile. These were the Milesians, the sons of Mil Espine, whose very name would become synonymous with the Irish people themselves, for they were destined to be the ancestors of all who would call the Emerald Isle their home. Their journey to Ireland had begun far from any Celtic shore, in the sun-baked lands of Scythia, where their ancestor Phineas Farsaid had learned the arts of language and law. From there, his descendants had wandered through Egypt, where they served pharaohs and learned the secrets of ancient wisdom. They had dwelt in Spain, where Milespine himself had ruled as a great king, and it was from the Tower of Breogan on the Spanish coast that his son Eath had first glimpsed the distant shores of Ireland, shimmering like a green jewel across the northern seas. But their coming to Ireland was not born of conquest alone. Eath had sailed to the mysterious island to explore its wonders, and there he had been treacherously murdered by the jealous kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who feared that his wisdom and nobility might threaten their rule. When Eath's body was returned to Spain, his kinsmen swore a great oath of vengeance, and Mil's 8 sons prepared the greatest fleet that had ever sailed from Iberian shores. Leading this expedition were heroes whose names would echo through Irish history like thunder rolling across the hills. There was Aber Finn, whose beauty rivaled that of the gods themselves, and Erimon, whose strategic mind could see victory where others saw only defeat. Eath's son Lugaid sailed with them, burning for vengeance against his father's killers. Emergin the poet accompanied the warriors, for they knew that words could be as powerful as weapons in the contests to come. And with them came their wives, their children, their druids and craftsmen, for this was not a raid, but a great migration, the movement of an entire people toward their promised homeland. As the Milesian fleet approached the coast of Ireland, the very elements seemed to rise against them. The Tuatha Dé Danann, masters of druidcraft and weather magic, summoned storms that would have destroyed any mortal vessels. Waves tall as mountains crashed over the ships, winds howled with the voices of banshees, and darkness fell across the sea like a shroud. But the Milesians had their own druids, led by the wise Emergin, and he knew the proper words to speak against such supernatural opposition. Standing in the prow of the lead ship, with spray lashing his face and lightning splitting the sky above, Emergin raised his voice in the first poem ever spoken by a mortal in Irish waters. His words carried the power of truth itself, invoking the eternal laws that bound even the gods, calling upon the very spirit of Ireland to judge between the claims of the divine people and the mortal children of Mil. "I am the wind across the sea," Emergin chanted, his voice somehow carrying above the howling storm. "I am the wave of the ocean. I am the murmur of the billows. I am the ox of the 7 combats. I am the vulture upon the rocks. I am the beam of the sun. I am the fairest of plants. I am the wild boar in valor. I am the salmon in the water. I am the lake in the plain." As each line of the poem rang out across the waters, the supernatural storm began to weaken. The waves that had threatened to overwhelm the Milesian ships grew calmer. The winds that had blown them off course shifted to fill their sails, and the darkness that had hidden the sun began to lift. For Emergin's words had touched something deeper than magic, something that the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves could not control, the very essence of the land itself, which recognized in these mortal voyagers the people destined to be its children. When the Milesian fleet finally reached the shores of Ireland, they found a reception committee waiting for them, but not the one they might have expected. Instead of armed warriors prepared for battle, 3 of the greatest queens among the Tuatha Dé Danann stood upon the beach, their otherworldly beauty making the very air shimmer around them. These were Banba, Fodla, and Eriu, each a goddess in her own right, each an embodiment of different aspects of the land they had helped to shape. Banba was the first to speak. Her voice like music played on silver harps. She welcomed the Milesians to the island, but asked that if they proved victorious in the contests to come, they would name the land after her, preserving her memory in the very words that future generations would use to describe their homeland. Fodla made a similar request, as did Eriu, each seeking immortality through the names that mortals would speak. Emergen, wise in the ways of words and their power, promised each goddess that her name would indeed be remembered, but it was to Eriu that he made the greatest pledge. "Your name," he told her, "shall be the chief name by which this island is known, and it shall endure until the end of time itself." And so it was that Ireland received its most enduring name, from the goddess who had loved the land so deeply that she was willing to share it with mortals. But these courteous exchanges were merely the prelude to more serious negotiations. The three kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Mac Cuil, Mac Secht, and Mac Graine, husbands to the three queens, arrived to parley with the Milesian leaders. They acknowledged that the mortals had reached Ireland despite all supernatural opposition, proving that destiny was indeed on their side. Yet they asked for time to consider their response, requesting that the Milesians withdraw beyond the 9th wave from shore, a distance considered to be outside the territorial waters of Ireland. It seemed a reasonable request, and the Milesians agreed, sailing their fleet back beyond the specified boundary to await the decision of the divine kings. But it was here that the treachery of some among the Tuatha Dé Danann revealed itself. As soon as the mortal ships had withdrawn, certain factions among the divine people began weaving their most powerful storm magic, calling up winds and waves that would dash the Milesian fleet against the rocks and end their threat forever. The supernatural tempest that arose made their earlier storm seem like a gentle breeze by comparison. Waves rose like moving mountains, their crests wreathed in foam that gleamed with unnatural light. The wind howled with voices that spoke in tongues no mortal ear should hear, and the very sea seemed to come alive with malevolent purpose. Ships that had weathered a dozen ordinary storms found their hulls cracking under pressures that defied natural law. It was then that the true character of the Milesian heroes revealed itself. Lesser men might have despaired, might have turned their ships away from the cursed island and sought easier conquests elsewhere. But the sons of Mil had not sailed across half the world to be turned back by supernatural opposition. They had come to claim their destiny, and neither gods nor demons would prevent them from setting foot on the land that called to their blood. Emergen once again proved his worth, not just as a poet, but as a druid whose wisdom rivaled that of the divine people themselves. He recognized the storm for what it was, not a natural phenomenon, but a working of magic that violated the very laws of hospitality that the Tuatha Dé Danann claimed to honor. Standing once more in the storm-lashed prow of his ship, he raised his voice against the supernatural tempest, not with magic of his own, but with words of justice that cut through the chaos like a sword through silk. "She let the land of Ireland be fertile," he cried, his voice somehow carrying to every ship in the fleet despite the howling wind. "Let her coastlands be fishing banks. Let fish teem in her rivers. Let fruit hang heavy on her trees in the woods. Let wheat and barley be ripe in her fields. Let there be honey and milk in the land. Let there be ale and feast. Let warriors feast in her halls, and let her children multiply." These words of blessing, spoken over the very waters where the Tuatha Dé Danann were working their curses, created a profound resonance that shook the foundations of the magic being woven against the mortals. For Emergen was not calling down destruction upon Ireland or its people. but rather speaking of abundance and prosperity, of a future where the land would flourish under mortal stewardship. His vision was so pure, so free of malice or hatred, that it touched the very heart of what Ireland could become. The supernatural storm began to falter as competing visions of the future struggled for dominance in the realm of magic and destiny. Some among the Tuatha Dé Danann found their own hearts stirring at Emergen's words, remembering that they themselves had once been strangers seeking a new home, that they too had faced opposition from those who had ruled before them. The unity needed to maintain such a massive working of storm magic began to crack, and with it, the tempest itself began to weaken. But the damage had already been done. Several Milesian ships had been lost in the supernatural storm, and among the casualties were some of Mil's own sons. Eber Dawn, eldest of the brothers, and perhaps the most warlike among them, had spoken harsh words against the goddesses of Ireland when they first met upon the beach. His pride and anger had marked him for doom, and when the storm struck, it was his ship that bore the brunt of the divine wrath. He perished beneath the waves, becoming the first of the Milesians to die in sight of the promised land. The surviving sons of Mil, grief-stricken but not deterred, pressed on toward the shore. They had paid a terrible price for their destiny, but they would not let their brother's sacrifice be in vain. As their remaining ships finally ground against the Irish beaches, the Milesian warriors leaped into the surf with weapons ready and war cries on their lips. The time for negotiation had passed. Now would come the final test that would determine whether mortals or gods would rule the Emerald Isle. The battle that followed was unlike any conflict that had ever been fought on Irish soil. This was not merely a clash between two armies, but a confrontation between two different ages of the world. On one side stood the Tuatha Dé Danann, beings of divine power and supernatural skill, wielding weapons forged in otherworldly fires and drawing upon magic that could reshape reality itself. On the other side fought the Milesians, mortal men and women armed with iron weapons and burning with the desperate courage of those who had nothing left to lose. The very landscape seemed to take sides in the conflict. Where the Tuatha Dé Danann walked, the earth itself rose to aid them, creating barriers of stone and thorn to impede their enemies. Springs bubbled up to provide them with fresh water, while clouds gathered to shield them from the sun. But where the Milesians fought, iron struck sparks from stone, and their war cries echoed from the hills like the voices of the land itself calling out in recognition of its future children. Ahriman led the Milesian warriors with tactical brilliance that impressed even his divine opponents. He had studied the ways of war in many lands, learning from Egyptian generals and Spanish champions, and he adapted those lessons to the unique challenges of fighting against supernatural foes. Where brute force failed against opponents who could command the elements themselves, he used cunning and mobility, striking swiftly and withdrawing before divine magic could be brought to bear. Eber Finn fought with a different style, his beauty and grace making him seem almost divine himself as he moved through the battle like a dancer performing a deadly ballet. His sword seemed to flow like water, finding gaps in the most perfect defenses, and his very presence inspired the mortal warriors around him to feats of courage that astonished even themselves. But it was perhaps the women of the Milesians who proved most crucial to the ultimate victory. Scota, wife of Mil himself and mother to many of the heroes, had not come to Ireland merely to watch her sons fight for their inheritance. She was a warrior in her own right, trained in the arts of combat by the same masters who had taught her husband. When she saw the tide of battle turning against the mortals, she rallied the women of the fleet and led them into combat with such fierce determination that the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves fell back before her charge. Tí, wife of Ahriman, proved equally formidable, but her weapons were wisdom and strategy rather than sword and spear. She moved through the battlefield like a general directing a campaign, coordinating the efforts of scattered Milesian groups and ensuring that their limited numbers were used to maximum advantage. Her tactical genius complemented her husband's leadership, creating a partnership that multiplied the effectiveness of their forces. As the battle raged across the Irish countryside, it became clear that this would not be decided by simple military victory. The Tuatha Dé Danann could not be defeated by force of arms alone, for they were divine beings whose power came from sources beyond the mortal world. But neither could they simply overwhelm the Milesians through magic, for destiny itself seemed to be fighting on the side of the mortals. It was Emergen who finally proposed the solution that would end the conflict without requiring the complete destruction of either side. Calling for a halt to the fighting, he challenged the kings of the Tuatha Dé Danann to settle the matter through a contest of wisdom rather than warfare. Let each side present their case before the land itself, he suggested, and let Ireland choose which people should rule over her. The divine kings, seeing the wisdom in this proposal, and perhaps recognizing that continued fighting would only bring destruction to the land they all loved, agreed to this unprecedented trial. Representatives from both sides gathered at Tara, the sacred hill that had been the seat of power since the first days of the Tuatha Dé Danann's rule. There, before the stone of destiny and under the open sky, they would present their arguments for why they deserved to be the guardians of Ireland. Mac Cuil spoke first for the Tuatha Dé Danann, his voice carrying the authority of ages. He reminded all present that his people had brought the 4 great treasures to Ireland, had cleared the land and made it fertile, had defended it against the chaotic forces of the Fomorians. They had ruled justly and wisely, he argued, bringing magic and wonder to a land that had known only hardship before their arrival. What right did these mortals have to demand what the gods had built with their own hands? But when Emergen rose to answer, his words carried a different kind of power. He spoke not of conquest or divine right, but of love. The Milesians had not come to Ireland seeking easy plunder or dominion over others, he explained. They had come because the land itself had called to them across the sea, because their hearts had recognized in Ireland the home they had been seeking through all their generations of wandering. We do not seek to diminish the glory of the Tuatha Dé Danann, Emergen said, his voice carrying to every corner of the great assembly. We acknowledge their great deeds and the wonders they have wrought. But we ask this: should not Ireland belong to those who will love her best? We offer not to rule over the land as conquerors, but to serve her as devoted children, to tend her fields and forests, to raise our families in her valleys, to live and die defending her beauty. As he spoke, something extraordinary happened. The stone of destiny, that great treasure of the Tuatha Dé Danann, which had remained silent for so long, suddenly rang out with a clear, musical note that could be heard across all of Ireland. The sound seemed to come not from the stone itself, but from the very heart of the land, and all who heard it understood its meaning. Ireland herself had chosen her people. The Tuatha Dé Danann, recognizing the judgment that had been rendered, bowed their heads in acceptance. They were too wise and too noble to fight against destiny itself, especially when that destiny was proclaimed by the land they had served so faithfully. But this did not mean they would simply vanish from Ireland, leaving it entirely to mortal hands. Instead, they proposed a solution that would honor both peoples and ensure that Ireland would benefit from the wisdom of both divine and mortal guardians. The Tuatha Dé Danann would withdraw from the visible world, taking up residence in the other world that existed parallel to the mortal realm. From there, they would continue to watch over Ireland, influencing its seasons and harvests, inspiring its artists and warriors, appearing to mortals in times of great need or great celebration. The division of Ireland between the two peoples was negotiated with careful attention to the needs of both. The Milesians would have the world above ground, the green fields and flowing streams, the forests and mountains, the coastlines and harbors where they could build their homes and raise their children. The Tuatha Dé Danann would take the world below, the ancient burial mounds and sacred hills, the mysterious lakes and hidden valleys where magic still flowed like water. This arrangement created something unique in the history of the world, a land where two different levels of reality coexisted, where the magical and the mundane were forever intertwined. Ireland became a place where a farmer might plow his fields by day and hear fairy music by night, where a warrior could win glory in battle and then encounter gods walking disguised among mortals. The great seedy mounds that dotted the Irish landscape became gateways between the worlds, places where the Tuatha Dé Danann held their courts and celebrated their eternal feasts. Newgrange, the Brúna Boyne, became the palace of the Dagda and his son Angus Og. The hill of Knockma in Galway became the seat of Finvara, king of the Connaught fairies. Countless other hills and ancient sites throughout Ireland became homes to the divine people, who were now known as the Eos Se, the people of the fairy mounds. But the influence of the Tuatha Dé Danann extended far beyond their hidden kingdoms. They became the unseen force that shaped Irish culture and character, the source of the island's reputation for producing poets and storytellers, musicians and warriors of exceptional skill. When a bard composed verses that moved listeners to tears, when a harper played melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of joy or sorrow, when a hero performed deeds that seemed impossible for mortal men, it was said that the divine people had touched them with their blessing. The establishment of the high kingship at Tara formalized the new order, with Eamon becoming the first mortal high king of Ireland. But even this most earthly of institutions was blessed by otherworldly power. The coronation ceremony included rituals that acknowledged the continued presence of the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the Stone of Destiny would cry out in recognition only when the rightful king touched it, ensuring that the divine people retained a voice in who would rule their beloved land. The division of Ireland between Eamon and his brother Aber Finn created the fundamental geographic and cultural patterns that would shape Irish history for millennia to come. Eamon took the northern half of the island, from the great fortress of Emain Macha in Ulster to the sacred sites of the Boyne Valley. Aber Finn claimed the south, establishing his capital at the royal site of Cashel and extending his domain to the dramatic coastlines of Kerry and Cork. This division reflected more than political convenience. The two brothers represented different aspects of the Irish character that would appear again and again throughout the island's history. Eamon embodied the strategic political mind that could unite diverse tribes under a single authority and deal diplomatically with outside powers. Aber Finn represented the artistic, passionate spirit that would make Ireland famous for its poetry, music, and fierce independence. For a time, the two kingdoms coexisted peacefully, with both brothers honoring their father's memory and working together to establish Milesian rule throughout Ireland. They founded great royal sites, established laws that drew upon the wisdom they had learned in their travels, and began the long process of organizing the Celtic tribes of Ireland into a unified nation. But the peace between the brothers was not destined to last. Differences in temperament and philosophy that had been mere family squabbles during their youth grew into serious political disagreements once they held the fate of kingdoms in their hands. Eber Finn chafed under what he saw as his brother's overly cautious approach to governance, while Ahriman worried that his brother's impulsiveness would bring disaster upon their new kingdom. The conflict that eventually erupted between them became known as the First Civil War of Irish history, and it established patterns of internal strife that would echo through the ages. But even in their opposition to each other, both brothers remained true to the highest ideals of Irish kingship, fighting not for personal gain, but for their vision of what Ireland could become. The tragedy that ended this conflict cast a long shadow over the early Milesian period. In the Battle of Gestan, Eber Finn fell to his brother's forces, dying with a warrior's courage but leaving behind questions about what might have been if the two brothers had found a way to resolve their differences peacefully. Ahriman's grief at his brother's death was profound, for he had never wanted to rule alone, and the victory that made him sole High King of Ireland felt more like a defeat. Yet from this tragedy came wisdom that would guide Irish kingship for generations to come. Ahriman established the principle that the High King must rule not just through strength, but through justice, that power without honor was worse than useless. He created the great legal assemblies where disputes could be settled through law rather than warfare, and he established the tradition of royal hospitality that would make the Irish courts famous throughout Europe. The early centuries of Milesian rule saw the establishment of the institutions and customs that would define Irish civilization. The great royal sites at Tara, Emain Macha, Cú Chulainn, and Cashel became centers not just of political power, but of learning and culture. The druids, those wise men and women who served as judges, teachers, and keepers of ancient lore, developed schools where young nobles could learn the arts of governance, poetry, and natural philosophy. The Irish legal system, known as the Brehon Laws, evolved into one of the most sophisticated legal codes in the ancient world. These laws recognized not just the rights of kings and nobles, but the dignity of every person, from the highest chief to the humblest farmer. They provided for the protection of women, children, and even slaves, establishing principles of justice that were remarkably advanced for their time. Irish poetry and storytelling reached new heights during this period, as bards began weaving together the ancient myths of the Tuatha Dé Danann with the heroic deeds of mortal kings and warriors. The great saga cycles that would become the glory of Irish literature had their origins in these early centuries of Milesian rule, when the memory of the divine people was still fresh and their influence still strongly felt in everyday life. The establishment of the four provincial kingdoms, Ulster, Connacht, Leinster, and Munster, created a political structure that balanced central authority with regional autonomy. Each province developed its own character and traditions, yet all acknowledged the supremacy of the High King at Tara. This system allowed for diversity within unity, enabling different Celtic tribes to maintain their distinct identities while participating in a larger Irish nation. Trade networks established during this period connected Ireland to the broader Celtic world and beyond. Irish gold and craftswork became prized throughout Europe, while exotic goods from distant lands found their way to Irish royal courts. The island that had once been isolated on the edge of the known world became a vital link in the commercial and cultural networks that bound the ancient world together. But perhaps the greatest achievement of the early Milesian period was the successful integration of mortal and immortal elements in Irish society. The Tuatha Dé Danann had not vanished from Ireland. They had simply withdrawn to a different level of existence. Their influence could be felt in every aspect of Irish life, from the changing of the seasons to the inspiration that touched poets and craftsmen. The festivals that marked the turning of the year, Samhain, Imbolc, Beltane, and Lugnasad, became occasions when the barrier between the mortal world and the other world grew thin, allowing for communication and interaction between the two peoples. These celebrations preserved the ancient wisdom while adapting it to the needs of a mortal society, creating traditions that would endure long after the original meanings had been forgotten. As the centuries passed and the Milesian kingdoms grew in strength and sophistication, the stage was being set for the emergence of the great heroes whose deeds would form the next great cycle of Irish mythology. The Ulster cycle, with its tales of Cú Chulainn and the Knights of the Red Branch, was about to begin, bringing with it stories of honor and tragedy that would rival anything in world literature. But that is a tale for another time, as our journey through the mists of Celtic mythology continues to unfold, carrying us deeper into the magical realm where gods and mortals, heroes and monsters, love and war all interweave in the eternal dance of story that has captivated hearts and minds for thousands of years. As the mists of time swirled around the newly established Milesian kingdoms, carrying with them the whispers of ancient prophecies and half-remembered dreams, a new chapter in Ireland's story was about to unfold. The sons and daughters of Mill had claimed their inheritance, but with it came responsibilities that would test their courage and wisdom in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. In the fertile valleys of Ulster, where the River Boyne wound its way through landscapes blessed by the hidden people, a child was born whose destiny would shake the very foundations of the mortal world. This was not the birth of an ordinary prince, though royal blood flowed in his veins. This was the arrival of one who would bridge the gap between human ambition and divine purpose, whose very existence would challenge the careful balance established between the world above and the world below. The child's birth was heralded by omens that made even the wisest druids pause in wonder. On the night he entered the world, every fire in Ulster blazed higher than it ever had before, as if the very spirit of flame itself was celebrating. The horses in the royal stables whinnied with voices that carried notes of otherworldly music, and the sacred wells throughout the province bubbled with water that gleamed like liquid starlight under the moon. His mother, Dechtire, sister to King Conchobar Macnessa of Ulster, had experienced a pregnancy unlike any other in the annals of Irish lore. She had been visited in dreams by Lugh himself, the shining god of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who had promised that her child would be touched by divine fire. The god had appeared to her not as the terrible warrior who had slain Balor of the Evil Eye, but as a being of pure light whose beauty surpassed even the golden dawn breaking over the hills of Ireland. When the child was finally born, the midwives gasped in amazement, for he bore the unmistakable marks of otherworldly heritage. His eyes held depths that seemed to reflect the very cosmos itself, shifting from blue to green to silver like the changing seas around Ireland's coast. His hair caught the light in ways that seemed to defy nature, sometimes appearing as dark as a raven's wing, other times gleaming with threads of gold that moved independently of any earthly breeze. But it was his hands that truly marked him as different from other children. Even as an infant, his tiny fingers possessed a strength that amazed all who witnessed it. When he grasped the thumb of Cathbad, the druid, the wise man felt power flowing through the child's touch, a force that spoke of destinies yet to be fulfilled and deeds that would echo through eternity. The druids gathered to read the signs surrounding this remarkable birth, casting their ogham sticks and studying the flight patterns of birds across the Ulster sky. Their pronouncements filled the royal court with equal measures of pride and trepidation. This child, they declared, would become the greatest warrior Ireland had ever known, a champion whose strength would be matched only by his tragedy, whose glory would burn so brightly that it would illuminate the darkness of ages yet to come. They named him Setanta, and from his earliest days, it was clear that the prophecies spoke true. While other children played with wooden toys and learned their letters, Setanta displayed abilities that defied explanation. At the age of 5, he could outrun the swiftest horses in the royal stables, his small legs carrying him across the countryside with a speed that seemed to blur the very air around him. His appetite for learning matched his physical prowess. The boy absorbed knowledge like parched earth drinks in the summer rain, mastering the complex genealogies of Irish kings, the intricate laws that governed society, and the ancient stories that preserved the wisdom of ages past. When the bards recited the great cycles of mythology around the evening fires, Setanta listened with an intensity that unnerved even the most experienced storytellers, his young eyes reflecting an understanding that seemed far beyond his years. But it was in the arts of war that the child truly excelled, displaying a natural talent that amazed even the battle-hardened warriors of Ulster's famous Red Branch Knights. Before he could properly hold a full-sized sword, Setanta was fashioning weapons from whatever materials came to hand. Sticks became spears that flew straighter than those crafted by master smiths. Stones became missiles that never missed their targets, and even flowers woven together could serve as bonds strong enough to restrain grown men. The court of King Conchobar mac Nessa watched the boy's development with growing wonder and concern. Here was a child who seemed to embody the very essence of the heroic ideal that had driven the Milesians to claim Ireland as their own. Yet his power was clearly touched by the otherworld in ways that made him as dangerous as he was magnificent. Conchobar himself was a king of unusual wisdom and foresight, having been guided to his throne by prophecies and blessed with advisors whose knowledge spanned both the mortal and immortal realms. His court at Emain Macha had become the jewel of Ulster, a place where the finest warriors gathered to test their skills against one another, where poets competed to craft verses worthy of the heroic age, and where the ancient traditions of Irish kingship flourished under his enlightened rule. The Red Branch Knights who served Conchobar were themselves legends in the making, warriors whose individual exploits would have been sufficient to ensure their immortality in song and story. There was Fergus MacRoich, whose strength was so legendary that he could split mountains with his bare hands, and whose wisdom in matters of war was sought by kings throughout Ireland. Conall Cernach, the victorious, had never lost a battle, and wore around his waist a belt strung with the heads of his enemies, each one taken in fair combat, according to the strict codes of warrior honor. Among these heroes, young Setanta moved like a bright star among lesser lights, his presence somehow making even the greatest warriors seem diminished by comparison. Yet rather than resenting the extraordinary child, the Red Branch Knights found themselves drawn to him, recognizing in his unbridled potential the fulfillment of everything they had dedicated their lives to achieving. It was Fergus MacRoich who first proposed that the boy should be formally inducted into the warrior band, despite his tender age. This child, the great hero declared before the assembled court, possesses gifts that come perhaps once in 1,000 years. To delay his training would be to waste talents that the gods themselves have placed in our keeping. Cathbad the Druid, however, counseled patience. His deep study of the mystical arts had shown him glimpses of futures that filled his ancient heart with both hope and dread. Great gifts, he warned, often come with great prices. The boy's destiny is woven with threads of gold and shadow alike. We must be careful not to hasten him toward a fate that may already be approaching too quickly. The debate over Setanta's future divided the court, with some arguing that exceptional talents demanded exceptional opportunities, while others insisted that wisdom lay in allowing the child to develop at a more natural pace. The boy himself seemed oblivious to these discussions, spending his days in pursuits that would have challenged warriors 3 times his age. He had discovered the ancient training ground where the red-branched knights honed their skills, a circular field surrounded by standing stones that had been blessed by the druids to enhance the abilities of those who practiced within its bounds. There, Setanta would spend hours perfecting techniques that he seemed to learn through instinct rather than instruction, his small form moving through complex combat sequences with a grace and precision that left observers speechless. His favorite weapon was the hurley stick, used in the ancient Irish game that combined sport with martial training. In Setanta's hands, this simple implement became an extension of his will, capable of driving a ball with such force and accuracy that it could split a hair at 100 paces or shatter stones with the sound of thunder. The other boys who tried to play against him quickly learned that matching skills with the young prodigy was an exercise in futility. But it was not just his physical abilities that set Setanta apart from his peers. The child possessed an intuitive understanding of strategy and tactics that amazed even veteran commanders. When the Red Branch Knights practiced their formations, Setanta could spot weaknesses in their arrangements that had escaped the notice of men with decades of battlefield experience. His suggestions for improvement were invariably sound, delivered with a confidence that would have seemed arrogant in anyone else but appeared perfectly natural coming from him. The supernatural aspects of his nature manifested in other ways as well. Animals seemed drawn to the boy, recognizing something in him that transcended ordinary humanity. The great hunting hounds of Ulster would abandon their masters to follow at his heels, their fierce loyalty transferring itself to this small figure who commanded their respect without effort. Even the wild creatures of the forest showed no fear of him, allowing him to approach with a trust they granted to no other human. Stories began to circulate throughout Ulster of the remarkable child, whose very presence seemed to bring good fortune to those around him. Farmers reported that their crops grew more abundantly when Setanta passed through their fields. Warriors claimed that their weapons struck truer after the boy had touched them. Poets found that verses flowed more freely from their lips when he was among their audience. Yet for all his extraordinary gifts, Setanta remained in many ways a normal child, delighting in games and mischief with an enthusiasm that reminded observers of his mortality. He loved nothing more than to slip away from the watchful eyes of his guardians and explore the countryside around Emain Macha, seeking out hidden valleys and secret streams where he could practice his skills away from the constant scrutiny of the court. It was during one of these solitary expeditions that Setanta first encountered representatives of the hidden people who had withdrawn from the visible world but never truly departed from Ireland. He had been following a particularly elusive deer through a grove of ancient oaks when he suddenly found himself in a clearing that had not been there moments before, standing before a figure whose beauty transcended anything he had ever imagined. The being who faced him was clearly of the Tuatha Dé Danann, though whether male or female was impossible to determine, for their form seemed to shift subtly in response to the observer's expectations. They were clothed in garments that appeared to be woven from moonlight and shadow, and their eyes held the wisdom of ages beyond counting. "So," the figure said, their voice carrying harmonies that seemed to resonate in the very air around them. "The child of two worlds has found his way to our realm at last. We have been watching you, young one, wondering when you would seek us out." Setanta, though awed by the encounter, felt no fear. Something deep within his spirit recognized these beings as kindred, creatures whose nature was as mixed and complex as his own. "I did not seek you out," he replied with the honesty that was one of his defining characteristics. "I was following a deer that led me here." The otherworldly being smiled, an expression that seemed to illuminate the entire clearing. "All paths lead where they are meant to lead, child of prophecy. The deer was merely the means by which destiny brought you to this moment. We have gifts for you, tokens that will serve you well in the trials that lie ahead. What transpired in that mystical clearing would remain forever private between Setanta and his divine benefactors. But when he finally returned to Emain Macha, those who knew him best could see that something fundamental had changed. The boy moved with even greater confidence than before, and there was a new depth to his gaze that spoke of knowledge gained and responsibilities accepted. King Conchobar, ever sensitive to the currents of fate that flowed around his court, summoned the boy for a private audience. In the quiet of his royal chambers, away from the bustle of courtly life, the king studied his young nephew with the intensity of one who had learned to read the signs of destiny in the faces of those around him. "You have been touched by the other world," Conchobar observed, his voice carrying neither accusation nor concern, merely the statement of an obvious fact. "I can see it in your eyes, boy. The question is whether this touch will prove to be a blessing or a curse." Setanta met his uncle's gaze without flinching. "I believe it will be both, my lord," he answered with a wisdom that seemed far beyond his years. "All great gifts carry great burdens. I am prepared to bear whatever weight the gods place upon my shoulders." The king nodded slowly, recognizing in those words an acceptance of fate that marked the true beginning of a hero's journey. "Then perhaps it is time," he said at last, "for you to take your place among the warriors of Ulster. But first, there is someone you must meet. Someone whose friendship will prove more valuable to you than all the weapons in my armory." The someone Conchobar spoke of was a boy only slightly older than Setanta, but whose reputation for wisdom and loyalty had already spread throughout the kingdom. His name was Ferdiad, and he was destined to become not only Setanta's closest friend, but also, in the cruel way that fate often works its will, his greatest sorrow. Ferdiad was the son of a chieftain from the border regions of Ulster, an area where constant skirmishes with neighboring kingdoms had bred a people known for their courage and their skill in battle. But unlike many warrior children, who were shaped solely by the harsh demands of frontier life, Ferdiad possessed a gentle soul that had somehow survived the brutality of his upbringing. When the two boys first met in the great hall of Emain Macha, surrounded by the assembled nobility of Ulster, observers noted the immediate bond that formed between them. It was as if they recognized in each other missing pieces of their own souls, complementary natures that together formed something greater than either could achieve alone. Where Setanta burned with the fierce intensity of a forge fire, Ferdiad possessed the steady warmth of a hearth flame. Where the future hero displayed the overwhelming confidence of one destined for greatness, his new friend offered the quiet wisdom of one who understood the price that greatness often demanded. Where Setanta's supernatural gifts set him apart from ordinary humanity, Ferdiad's thoroughly mortal nature kept him grounded in the everyday world that both boys would need to navigate. Their friendship became the stuff of legend, even before their individual heroic deeds had been accomplished. Together, they explored every corner of Ulster, seeking out the most challenging opponents for their games of combat, the most dangerous beasts for their hunting expeditions, the most learned druids for their studies of ancient lore. Under Ferdiad's influence, Setanta learned to temper his overwhelming abilities with consideration for others, to recognize that true strength lay not in the power to dominate, but in the wisdom to know when to hold back. Under Setanta's guidance, Ferdiad discovered reserves of courage and skill within himself that he had never suspected, rising to heights of achievement that his modest nature would never have attempted alone. The two boys were inseparable, training together, studying together, getting into trouble together with the kind of wholehearted enthusiasm that only the young can bring to mischief. Their adventures became the source of countless stories told around the fires of Ulster. Tales that grew in the telling until it became difficult to separate fact from fond exaggeration. There was the time they decided to test their skills against the legendary salmon of knowledge that dwelt in a pool sacred to the druids, spending 3 days and nights trying to catch a fish that was said to grant wisdom to whoever consumed it. They never caught the salmon, but their efforts so impressed the druids with their determination and ingenuity that they were granted access to secret teachings normally reserved for much older students. Another famous exploit involved their attempt to tame a wild stallion that had been terrorizing the countryside around Emain Macha, a beast so fierce that experienced horsemen refused to approach it. Working together, the two boys managed not only to capture the animal, but to win its loyalty through patience and understanding, creating a bond between human and horse that became a model for all future attempts at such training. Their friendship was tested and strengthened through countless challenges, each trial serving to deepen their understanding of one another and their shared commitment to the ideals of heroic brotherhood. When Setanta's supernatural nature sometimes isolated him from his peers, Ferdiad stood by him, helping to bridge the gap between the extraordinary boy and the ordinary world. When Ferdiad's self-doubt threatened to hold him back from achieving his potential, Setanta's unwavering faith in his friend provided the encouragement needed to overcome any obstacle. As the seasons turned and the boys grew toward manhood, their reputation spread far beyond the borders of Ulster. Bards composed songs about their friendship, holding it up as an example of the bonds that could exist between true warriors. Kings from distant provinces sent gifts to Conchobar's court, hoping to win the future allegiance of these remarkable young men. Even the wise druids spoke of them as harbingers of a new golden age for Irish heroism. But beneath the celebration and acclaim, shadows were beginning to gather. Cathbad the Druid, whose gift of prophecy had guided Ulster through many crises, found his dreams increasingly troubled by visions of the future that filled his ancient heart with dread. He saw the two friends standing on opposite sides of a battlefield, their friendship transformed into enmity by forces beyond their control. He saw blood on the grass and tears in the eyes of those who loved them both. The wise druid kept these visions to himself, hoping that knowledge of them might somehow change the future they foretold. But in his heart, he knew that the greatest tragedies often spring from the greatest loves, and that the bond between Setanta and Ferdiad, which now seemed like Ulster's greatest blessing, might one day become its most terrible curse. For now, however, such dark possibilities remained hidden in the mists of an uncertain future. The present moment belonged to youth and friendship, to the joy of discovery and the thrill of testing one's abilities against worthy challenges. The two boys continued their adventures with undiminished enthusiasm, unaware that each shared experience was weaving the threads of a destiny that would one day require them to choose between personal loyalty and duty to their respective peoples. As winter began to settle over the green hills of Ulster, bringing with it the long nights when storytellers held sway around the glowing hearths, preparations began for an event that would mark a turning point in both boys' lives. King Conchobar had decided that the time had come for Setanta to undergo the trials that would formally admit him to the ranks of the Red Branch Knights, despite his youth. The trials themselves were shrouded in ancient tradition and mystery, tests that had been designed by the first warriors of Ulster to separate the truly worthy from those who merely aspired to greatness. No one who had not passed through them could claim the right to bear arms in defense of the kingdom, and many who had attempted them had failed, sometimes with consequences far more serious than mere disappointment. Yet, as the preparations for these trials began, another event was being planned that would change everything. A feast was to be held at the fortress of Cuchulainn the smith, one of the most skilled craftsmen in all of Ireland, whose weapons were sought after by warriors from every corner of the Celtic world. King Conchobar had been invited to attend this celebration, and it was customary for him to bring with him a selection of his finest warriors and most promising young nobles. Neither Setanta nor anyone else at Emain Macha could have foreseen that this seemingly ordinary social occasion would become the stage for a transformation that would echo through the ages. The boy who would travel to Cuchulainn's fortress as Setanta would not return under that name, for destiny was preparing to reveal the true identity that had been hidden within him since birth. The greatest hero in Irish mythology was about to claim his legendary name, and with it, a fate that would elevate him to the pinnacle of glory while simultaneously sealing his doom. The child touched by divine fire was about to become the Hound of Ulster, and Ireland would never be the same. The autumn wind carried whispers of change as it rustled through the oak groves surrounding Emain Macha, and those who understood the language of such things felt a trembling in the very fabric of destiny itself. The feast at Cuchulainn's fortress had been planned as a celebration of friendship and craftsmanship, a gathering where the finest warriors of Ulster would honor the greatest smith in all of Ireland. Yet as the appointed day approached, even the wisest druids could sense that forces beyond mortal understanding were stirring in the other world. Cuchulainn the smith was a man whose reputation extended far beyond the borders of Ulster. His forge had produced weapons that sang as they cut through the air, armor that could turn aside the strongest blows, and ornaments of such beauty that they were said to capture fragments of starlight within their golden curves. Kings from distant lands sent messengers bearing precious gifts, hoping to commission works from his legendary hands. Even the Tuatha Dé Danann themselves were rumored to seek out his craftsmanship, recognizing in his skill something that approached their own divine artistry. The fortress that Cuchulainn had built to house his workshops and protect his family was itself a marvel of construction. Massive stone walls rose from the living rock of a hillside, their surfaces carved with spirals and interlacing patterns that seemed to shift and move in the changing light. Within these walls, the constant ring of hammer on anvil created a rhythm that had become as familiar as a heartbeat to those who dwelt nearby. The very air around the fortress shimmered with heat from the great forges, where fires burned that were said never to have been extinguished since the first day Cuchulainn had claimed this place as his own. But it was not just the skill of his hands that made Cuchulainn famous throughout the Celtic world. The smith was also known for his fierce loyalty to those he called friend, and his equally fierce protection of those he loved. His household was defended not only by the stout walls of his fortress, but by a guardian whose reputation for ferocity had become legendary in its own right. This guardian was no ordinary hound, though it bore the form of one. Some whispered that it was a creature of the other world, a beast touched by the same divine fire that flowed through the weapons forged in Cuchulainn's workshops. Others claimed it was the offspring of supernatural wolves that had once served the Tuatha Dé Danann as hunting companions. Whatever its origins, the hound possessed strength that rivaled that of the greatest warriors, speed that made it seem like a blur of motion across the landscape, and intelligence that sometimes seemed almost human in its depth and complexity. The beast stood as tall as a man's shoulder, its coat the color of burnished copper shot through with threads of silver that caught the light like captured lightning. Its eyes held a fierce intelligence that unnerved even veteran warriors, and its voice, when raised in challenge or warning, could be heard for miles across the countryside. No enemy had ever penetrated Cuchulainn's defenses while the hound stood watch, and many who had attempted such folly had learned too late that the creature's loyalty to its master was matched only by its merciless efficiency in dealing with threats. King Conchobar had accepted Culainn's invitation with pleasure, for he valued the smith not only as a craftsman, but as a friend whose counsel he had come to trust in matters both great and small. The preparations for the royal visit had begun weeks in advance, with Culainn's household working to ensure that every detail would reflect the honor due to the High King of Ulster. The finest foods were prepared, the choicest wines brought up from deep cellars, and the great hall was decorated with examples of the smith's most magnificent work. As the day of the feast approached, Conchobar selected those who would accompany him with his usual careful consideration. The Red Branch Knights chosen for this honor represented the finest flower of Ulster's warrior nobility, men whose prowess in battle was matched by their wisdom in council and their understanding of the courtesies due to a generous host. Fergus MacRoich would attend, his massive presence a reassurance that no threat could touch the king while he stood guard. Conall Turnach would be there as well, his belt of enemy heads left behind for this peaceful occasion, but his reputation for invincibility preceding him nonetheless. Young Setanta had assumed he would be included in this distinguished company, for his status as the king's nephew and his growing reputation as a warrior had earned him a place in most royal expeditions. But as the morning of departure arrived, he found himself faced with an unexpected disappointment. A hurling match had been arranged at Emain Macha, a contest between the finest young warriors of Ulster that promised to be one of the greatest sporting events of the year. The boy's love for the ancient game was well known throughout the kingdom. His skill with the hurley stick had become legendary, his ability to drive the ball with impossible accuracy the subject of countless stories told around evening fires. The prospect of missing such a competition filled him with genuine regret, yet his duty to attend his uncle's feast seemed clear. It was Conchobar himself who resolved the dilemma, displaying the wisdom and understanding that had made him beloved by his people. "Stay for your game, nephew," the king said with a smile that held both affection and amusement. "Show these young warriors of Ulster what true skill looks like. When the match is finished, follow us to Culainn's fortress. The feast will last well into the night, and there will be time enough for you to join us before the evening's entertainment begins." The suggestion seemed perfectly reasonable to everyone involved. The road to Culainn's fortress was well known and relatively safe, running through countryside that had been at peace for years. Setanta was certainly capable of making the journey alone, and his late arrival would hardly disrupt the celebration. Indeed, his dramatic entrance might add an element of excitement to the evening's festivities, so it was decided. As the royal party departed Emain Macha in the early afternoon, their horses' hooves drumming a steady rhythm on the ancient stones of the road, Setanta remained behind to participate in the hurling match that had captured his imagination. The boy watched until the last of the riders disappeared over a distant hill, then turned his attention to the competition that awaited him. The hurling match that followed would be remembered for generations as one of the greatest displays of individual skill ever witnessed in Ulster. Setanta faced off against 27 of the finest young warriors in the kingdom, men who had trained for years to perfect their mastery of the ancient game. Yet from the moment the match began, it became clear that this would be no ordinary contest. The boy moved across the field like a force of nature unleashed, his hurley stick an extension of his will, his every motion flowing with a grace that seemed to defy the laws of physics themselves. He drove the ball with such power that it sang through the air like a missile, yet controlled it with such delicate precision that he could make it dance along the ground like a living thing responding to his commands. His opponents, brave warriors all, quickly discovered that matching skills with this extraordinary youth was an exercise in futility. Every strategy they devised, he countered with effortless ease. Every formation they arranged, He disrupted with moves that seemed to come from pure instinct. When they tried to overwhelm him with numbers, he simply moved faster than their eyes could follow. When they attempted to outthink him with clever tactics, he responded with innovations that left them staring in amazement. The match became less a competition than a demonstration, a showcase of abilities that transcended anything the spectators had ever witnessed. Setanta scored goal after goal with casual ease, his every shot finding its mark despite the desperate efforts of his opponents to stop him. Yet there was no arrogance in his dominance, no cruelty in his superiority. He played with the pure joy of one who had found perfect expression for his gifts, celebrating each success with the enthusiasm that was infectious rather than boastful. When the final horn sounded to end the match, the score told a story that would be recounted for generations. Setanta alone had outscored all 27 of his opponents combined, achieving a victory so complete that it redefined what was considered possible in the ancient game. Yet as the cheers of the spectators echoed across the field, the boy's thoughts were already turning to the feast that awaited him at Chulainn's fortress. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western hills, as Setanta finally set out from Emain Macha, his hurley stick still in his hand and his silver ball tucked securely in his belt pouch. The road stretched before him through countryside that wore the golden colors of approaching autumn, with fields of barley and wheat ready for harvest, and orchards heavy with fruit that perfumed the evening air. As he walked, the boy entertained himself with displays of skill that would have amazed any observer. He would drive his ball high into the air, then sprint forward to catch it before it could touch the ground. He would strike it with such force that it disappeared over distant hills, only to arrive at its landing spot before the ball itself, ready to continue his game. Sometimes he would hit the ball so hard that it seemed to vanish entirely, only to reappear in his hand as if it had never left his grasp. These casual demonstrations of impossible ability were simply part of who Setanta had become, expressions of power that felt as natural to him as breathing. He gave no thought to the supernatural nature of what he was doing, accepting his gifts with the unconscious ease of one who had never known life without them. The boy who could outrun the wind and strike with the force of lightning simply enjoyed his solitary journey, unaware that each step was carrying him closer to a destiny that would transform him forever. The miles passed swiftly beneath his feet, the landscape gradually changing as he moved from the familiar territories around Emain Macha into regions where his presence was less well known. Here, the very stones seemed to whisper with older memories, and the wind carried scents that spoke of mysteries hidden just beyond the edge of perception. This was country where the boundary between the mortal world and the other world grew thin, where ancient powers still stirred in the depths of forgotten groves and sacred springs. As twilight began to settle over the land, painting the sky in shades of purple and gold that would have inspired poets to new heights of eloquence, Setanta finally caught sight of his destination. Chulainn's fortress rose from its hilltop like a vision from the heroic age, its massive walls glowing in the last light of day, smoke from countless hearth fires rising into the evening air like offerings to the gods. The sound of celebration drifted down from the fortress, carried on the wind like distant music. Voices raised in song, the clash of cups in toast, the deep laughter of men who had set aside the burdens of war to enjoy the simple pleasures of friendship and hospitality. It was exactly the kind of gathering that Setanta loved most, where heroes could share their stories and warriors could test their wit against worthy opponents. But as the boy approached the gates of the fortress, confident in his welcome and eager to join the festivities, he could not have known that Chulainn's great hound had already been released for its nightly patrol. The smith, believing that all expected guests had arrived hours ago, had followed his customary practice of setting his guardian free to protect the fortress through the dark hours that lay ahead. The creature was already moving through the shadows around the outer walls, its supernatural senses alert for any sign of threat or intrusion. Its ears caught sounds that no mortal could hear. Its nose detected scents that carried messages written in a language older than words. Tonight, as on every night for years beyond counting, it would stand watch over those who sheltered within Chulainn's walls, ready to deal with any danger that might emerge from the darkness. As Setanta approached the main gate, still playing with his silver ball and humming one of the ancient songs he had learned from the court bards, the hound's attention was suddenly drawn by the sound of footsteps on the stone path. Here was an intruder, someone moving toward the fortress under cover of growing darkness, someone who had not been granted permission to approach the sacred space that the hound was sworn to protect. The great beast emerged from the shadows like a manifestation of primal fury, its copper coat seeming to burn with inner fire, its eyes blazing with the terrible light of absolute determination. It had never failed in its duty to Chulainn, had never allowed a single unauthorized person to pass beyond the outer defenses. Tonight would be no different, regardless of who this stranger might be or what powers they might possess. For a moment that seemed suspended outside the normal flow of time, boy and hound faced each other across the darkening courtyard. Here was the meeting that fate had been arranging since before either of them had been born, the collision of destinies that would reshape the very meaning of heroism in Ireland. The supernatural creature that had never known defeat was about to encounter the mortal child who had been touched by divine fire. Neither could yield, for yielding was not in their nature. Neither could retreat, for retreat would betray everything they were meant to be. In the space of a few heartbeats, the transformation that would create Ireland's greatest hero was about to begin, written in violence and sealed with a name that would echo through eternity. The hound gathered itself for its charge, every muscle coiled with the power that had made it the terror of Ulster's enemies. Setanta shifted his grip on his hurley stick, instincts older than thought preparing him for a battle that would test every gift the gods had placed within him. Around them, the very air seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the moment when legend would be born from the meeting of irresistible force and immovable will. What happened next would be told and retold around countless fires for thousands of years to come, each telling adding new details while preserving the essential truth of how a boy became a hero and a name became immortal. The feast continued within Chulainn's halls, the guests unaware that outside in the darkness, the future of Irish mythology was being decided in a contest between loyalty and destiny, between duty and transformation. The hound launched itself forward with the terrible speed of its supernatural nature, covering the distance between itself and its target in the space between one heartbeat and the next. Its massive form moved like liquid lightning, every line of its body expressing the perfect union of power and purpose that had made it the most feared guardian in all of Ulster. Its jaws gaped wide, revealing teeth that could crush bone and tear through the finest armor, while its eyes blazed with the cold fire of absolute determination. But Setanta was no ordinary intruder stumbling blindly into danger. The divine blood that flowed in his veins had awakened at the first sight of the charging beast, filling him with awareness that transcended normal human perception. Time seemed to slow around him as his supernatural nature responded to the ultimate test, allowing him to see each detail of the hound's attack with crystalline clarity. In that stretched moment of perfect perception, the boy made a choice that would echo through the ages. Rather than drawing back in fear or attempting to flee from an opponent whose reputation for invincibility was known throughout Ireland, Setanta stepped forward to meet the charge. His hurley stick swung in an arc, that seemed to capture and focus all the power of his extraordinary nature, connecting with the silver ball at the precise instant needed to transform it from a simple sphere of metal into a projectile guided by divine purpose. The ball struck the great hound in the throat with such force that it drove straight through the creature's body, the impact so tremendous that it seemed to shake the very foundations of the fortress. The beast's charge was halted instantly, its massive form crashing to the stone courtyard with the finality of a mountain avalanche. In the space of a single heartbeat, the guardian that had never known defeat had been overcome by a boy who had never known fear. Silence fell over the courtyard like a shroud, broken only by the distant sounds of celebration, still echoing from within the fortress walls. Setanta stood motionless beside the fallen hound, his hurley stick still gripped in hands that trembled not with fear, but with the overwhelming realization of what he had done. The creature that had been the terror of Ulster's enemies lay still at his feet, its fierce eyes closed forever, its duty finally ended by a force it could not have anticipated or understood. The crash of the hound's fall had been heard within the fortress, cutting through the sounds of feasting like a blade through silk. Conversations died in mid-sentence. Cups froze halfway to lips, and every eye turned toward the great doors that separated the celebration from whatever catastrophe had occurred in the darkness beyond. King Conchobar rose from his place of honor, his face pale with sudden understanding of what that sound might mean. Chulainn himself was the first to reach the courtyard, his powerful frame silhouetted against the light streaming from the open doorway. The smith's eyes took in the scene before him with the quick assessment of a man accustomed to violence, noting the still form of his beloved guardian and the young stranger who stood beside it. For a moment that stretched toward eternity, the master craftsman simply stared at the destruction of everything he had trusted to keep his household safe. Behind Chulainn came the assembled guests of the feast, warriors and nobles spilling out into the courtyard, with weapons half drawn and questions dying on their lips as they witnessed the impossible scene before them. The great hound that had been the pride of Ulster lay dead, killed by a boy who could not have seen more than 15 summers, slain by a weapon that was nothing more than a stick used for playing games. Fergus MacRoish pushed through the crowd, his massive presence clearing a path as he sought to understand what his experienced eyes were showing him. Here was young Setanta, the king's nephew, standing over the body of the most feared guardian in Ireland, apparently unharmed, despite having faced alone a creature that had terrorized armies. The implications of what he was seeing struck the great warrior like a physical blow, for he recognized in this moment the fulfillment of prophecies that had been whispered in the halls of Emain Macha for years. King Conchobar himself appeared in the doorway, his royal robes billowing around him as he strode into the courtyard, with the measured pace of one who had learned to master his emotions, even in the face of the impossible. His eyes met those of his nephew across the space that separated them, and in that silent exchange passed an understanding that needed no words. The boy who had left Emain Macha that afternoon was gone forever, transformed by necessity into something far greater and far more terrible. It was Chulainn who finally broke the silence, his voice heavy with grief that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. "My hound," he said, the words carrying across the courtyard like a lament for all the losses that war and fate had inflicted upon the world. "My faithful guardian, who has stood watch over my household for years beyond counting, who will protect my family now, who will keep my enemies at bay when darkness falls and evil things prowl the night." The smith's anguish was so profound that it seemed to fill the very air around him, touching the hearts of even the most battle-hardened warriors present. They understood what the great hound had meant to Chulainn, not merely as a guard, but as a companion whose loyalty had been absolute, whose presence had meant the difference between security and vulnerability for everyone who sheltered within these walls. Setanta stepped forward, his young face grave with an understanding that seemed far beyond his years. In that moment, those who watched could see the child he had been fading away like mist before the dawn, replaced by something harder and more purposeful, something shaped by the weight of responsibility and the recognition of destiny fulfilled. "I am sorry for your loss, Chulainn of the skillful hands," the boy said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard despite its youth. "I killed your hound in fair combat, defending myself against attack, but I take no joy in the deed." The creature was magnificent, a guardian worthy of the greatest heroes, and its death diminishes all of us. The smith nodded slowly, acknowledging the courtesy of the boy's words, while the grief continued to burn in his eyes like banked coals. "You speak truly, young warrior," he replied, using the title with careful deliberation. "The beast attacked you as it would any stranger approaching in darkness, and you defended yourself as any fighter would. I hold no anger against you for its death, but that does not ease the sorrow or solve the problem of what comes next." It was then that Setanta made the offer that would transform not only his own destiny, but the very nature of heroism itself in Ireland. Drawing himself up to his full height, though he was still just a boy among men, he spoke words that would echo through the ages and earn him immortality in song and story. "I will be your hound, Chulainn," he declared, his voice ringing with the certainty of one who had found his true purpose. "Until you can find and train another guardian to match the one I have slain, I will protect your household and your family. I will stand watch in the darkness and face whatever enemies may come. I will be as faithful to you as the creature I killed, and as fierce in your defense." The silence that followed these words was different from what had come before, pregnant with the recognition that something momentous had just occurred. This was not merely a boy offering to make amends for an accident, but a hero accepting the burden of duty that would define the rest of his life. In promising to serve as Chulainn's protector, Setanta was embracing a role that would transform him from a gifted youth into a legend. Cathbad the druid, who had followed the others into the courtyard despite his advanced age, stepped forward with the slow dignity of one who understood the full significance of what he was witnessing. His ancient eyes, which had seen the rise and fall of kingdoms, the birth and death of heroes, now focused on the boy with an intensity that seemed to pierce through flesh and bone to the very essence of his being. "From this night forward," the druid declared, his voice carrying the authority of one who spoke with prophetic knowledge, "you shall be known as Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster. The name Setanta dies with this day, for the man you are becoming requires a name that speaks of your true nature and your destined role." The words fell into the courtyard like stones dropped into still water, their ripples spreading outward to touch every person present. Cú Chulainn. The name seemed to hang in the air like an incantation, carrying within it echoes of all the deeds yet to be performed, all the glory yet to be won, all the tragedy yet to be endured. The boy who had been Setanta bowed his head in acceptance of both the name and the fate it represented. He understood, with the clarity that comes from divine heritage, that this moment marked the true beginning of his legend. Everything that had come before had been preparation. Everything that would follow would be consequence. King Conchobar approached his nephew, his expression mixing pride with sorrow in the complex way of those who love heroes while understanding the price they must pay for their greatness. Placing a hand on the boy's shoulder, he spoke words that would be remembered as long as Irish voices carried tales of ancient days. "Rise, Cú Chulainn of Ulster," the king said, his voice heavy with formal ceremony. "You have shown tonight that you possess not only the strength to defeat any enemy, but the honor to accept responsibility for your actions. The name you bear from this day forward will be spoken with respect throughout Ireland, and your deeds will be remembered when the stones of Emain Macha have crumbled to dust." The transformation was complete. The boy who had left the royal court that afternoon to play a simple game of hurling would never return, for in his place stood a hero whose legend would outlive empires. Cú Chulainn, the Hound of Ulster, had been born in violence and named in sorrow, but he would grow to embody the highest ideals of Irish heroism while simultaneously bearing the burden of a fate that would test every virtue he possessed. As the assembled warriors and nobles filed back into the fortress to continue their interrupted feast, the conversation naturally turned to speculation about what this remarkable youth might accomplish in the years to come. The Red Branch Knights, those champions who had thought they knew the limits of human achievement, found themselves reconsidering everything they believed about courage, skill, and destiny. Fergus MacRoish, whose own strength was legendary throughout the Celtic world, spoke for many when he observed that he had never seen anything to match what they had witnessed that night. "The boy moves like lightning given human form," he said, shaking his massive head in wonder. "I have fought beside the greatest heroes of 3 generations, but I have never seen such perfect unity of purpose and power." Conall Cernach, the victorious, whose belt of enemy heads testified to his own prowess in battle, nodded in agreement. "More than that," he added thoughtfully, "he shows the wisdom to use his gifts responsibly. A lesser man might have boasted of his victory or shown disrespect to Culann's grief. Instead, he offered to take upon himself the burden of replacing what he had destroyed." The discussion that followed would continue long into the night, as warriors and wise men attempted to place what they had witnessed into the context of their understanding of heroism and destiny. Some spoke of ancient prophecies that had foretold the coming of such a champion. Others recalled similar moments from the distant past, when extraordinary individuals had emerged to change the course of history. But it was Cathbad the Druid who spoke most truly about what the night's events meant for the future of Ulster and Ireland. Drawing upon wisdom earned through decades of studying the patterns of fate and the movements of divine will, he offered insights that would prove prophetic in ways that none present could fully comprehend. "What we have witnessed tonight," the ancient seer said, his voice carrying the weight of certain knowledge, "is the emergence of a hero who will define what it means to be Irish for all the generations yet to come. Cú Chulainn will perform deeds that will inspire poets until the end of time. But his greatest victory will not be won with weapons or strength. It will be won through his willingness to sacrifice everything for the principles he holds sacred." The Druid's words carried an undertone of sadness that puzzled some of his listeners, for surely the emergence of such a champion should be cause for celebration rather than sorrow. But those who knew Cathbad best understood that his gift of prophecy often showed him truths that were difficult to bear, futures that contained both triumph and tragedy in measures too complex for simple minds to understand. As the feast resumed within Culann's great hall, the atmosphere had been transformed by the evening's extraordinary events. Where before there had been the comfortable camaraderie of warriors sharing food and drink, now there was an electric tension born of witnessing the birth of legend. Every eye turned frequently toward the young hero who sat at the king's right hand, trying to reconcile the quiet dignity he displayed with the incredible violence they had seen him unleash. Cú Chulainn himself seemed almost unchanged by his transformation, accepting the attention with the same natural grace he had always shown. Yet those who looked closely could see subtle differences in his bearing, a new weight to his presence that spoke of burdens accepted and responsibilities embraced. The playful boy who had delighted in games and mischief had not disappeared entirely, but he was now overlaid with something deeper and more serious, like a sword wrapped in silk. The feast proceeded according to ancient custom, with each course accompanied by entertainment that showcased the finest talents of Ulster's court. Bards recited verses celebrating the deeds of legendary heroes, their voices rising and falling in the rhythmic patterns that made their words easier to remember and more powerful in their impact. Musicians played melodies that seemed to capture the very essence of Irish identity, while dancers moved with grace that appeared almost supernatural in the flickering firelight. Yet, as magnificent as these performances were, the assembled guests found their attention repeatedly drawn back to the young hero who had so dramatically announced his presence among them. When one of the bards began reciting the ancient tale of how Lugh had defeated Balor of the Evil Eye, many in the hall noticed similarities between that legendary victory and what they had witnessed in the courtyard. Both had involved a young champion facing an apparently invincible opponent. Both had required perfect timing and supernatural skill, and both had resulted in transformations that changed the course of history. King Conchobar, ever alert to the currents of emotion and opinion that flowed through his court, recognized that the evening's events had created an opportunity that must not be wasted. Rising from his seat with the measured dignity that marked all his public actions, he called for silence and prepared to address his assembled nobles and warriors. "My friends," the king began, his voice carrying easily throughout the great hall, "tonight we have witnessed something that occurs perhaps once in a lifetime, if we are fortunate enough to live in an age blessed by the gods. We have seen the emergence of a hero whose name will be remembered as long as Irish voices carry tales of valor and honor." The king's words were met with murmurs of agreement from throughout the hall, for all present had recognized the significance of what they had witnessed. But Conchobar was not finished, and his next words would shape how the kingdom would respond to this remarkable development. Cú Chulainn has shown us tonight that true heroism lies not merely in the possession of great gifts, but in the wisdom to use those gifts in service of others, the king continued. He could have boasted of his victory over Culann's hound, could have demanded recognition for his prowess, could have turned this moment to his own advantage. Instead, he chose to offer himself in service to the man he had wronged, accepting responsibility for his actions and seeking to make amends through sacrifice rather than words. The truth of these observations was evident to all who had witnessed the events in the courtyard, and many nodded in appreciation of the young hero's character. Yet there was more to come, for Conchobar had decided that this moment must be used to set expectations for what Cú Chulainn's role in Ulster society would become. "Therefore," the king declared, his voice taking on the formal tones reserved for royal proclamations, "I hereby name Cú Chulainn as a full member of the Red Branch Knights, despite his youth, for he has proven through deed rather than mere trial that he possesses the qualities we hold most sacred. Let him take his place among our greatest warriors, and let his example inspire us all to reach for the highest ideals of honor and service." The hall erupted in cheers at this announcement, for the Red Branch Knights represented the pinnacle of Ulster's military elite. To be named to their ranks was an honor that most warriors spent their entire lives hoping to achieve, and for it to be granted to one so young was unprecedented in the kingdom's history. Yet even as the assembled nobles and warriors celebrated this recognition of their newest hero, Cú Chulainn himself felt the weight of new responsibilities settling upon his shoulders like a mantle. He understood that his acceptance into the Red Branch was not merely an honor, but a binding commitment, a pledge to